Okay. Well, I would like to welcome everyone to the First Parish Lane Lyceum, and we're thrilled to have, I see a lot of new faces and, or at least names, and that's wonderful to have this broader interest. This is part of a 4-part series called A Just Harvest, Ethical Food Production, Consumption and Policy. And so these sessions will be over the next 2 months. We'll have about every 2 weeks, we'll have another speaker. So we're very excited to have this. We feel like it's such an important topic. And so we're thrilled to have Chris Bosso here tonight with us. And I will turn it over to Neil. I would ask that everybody mute themselves so that we don't have background noise. And we also ask people, if you have a clarifying question, feel free to put that in the chat, but otherwise we'll save questions until the end. Okay, very good.
All right, so I'd like to introduce my former colleague and friend, Christopher Bosso, who is professor of public policy and politics at Northeastern. His teaching and research areas are food and environmental policy, science and technology policy, and the governance of emerging technologies. His newest books are Framing the Farm Bill, Interests, Ideology, and the Agricultural Act of 2014, and Feeding Cities, Improving Local Food Access, Sustainability, and Resilience. His current research efforts include a book on the history, current politics, and future of supplemental nutritional assistance, the Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program, AKA SNAP, and the paper, Farm Programs and Food Stamps, Lessons from the Battle over TANF. Tonight, his talk will be based on his work for his new book, SNAP, A Political History of Food Stamps, the nation's largest, most unloved, and possibly least bad way to feed poor people. With that butchering of this introduction, I'll turn it over to Chris Bosso. Sorry about that, Chris.
That's all right, Neil. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Well, welcome everybody. And I'm about to share my screen because I'm an academic and I need slides. I'll talk for about 40 minutes and then we can have some discussion. And yeah, and as Neil said, this is based on a book that I'm working on right now on the political history of the food stamp program, now known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and its origins. And it's a shameless plug, division from the book that Neil referenced, the Framing the Farm Bill. And this is where I got interested in the food stamp program, in SNAP. It's the formal name is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And I get interested in this program when I was doing the research and writing of my book on the Farm Bill. And I'm a political scientist by training, and I was interested in the politics of the Farm Bill for reasons that I'm not even going to bother going into, but I got hooked into doing a book on the Farm Bill, which turned out to be a lot more interesting and instructive about our current political age than you would imagine. But what interested me about SNAP was this. We talk about the Farm Bill, but at the end of the day, the biggest chunk of, quote, Farm Bill spending, the USDA's budget, is nutrition programs, not farm commodity programs. It is, literally 80% of the USDA's annual budget is in mostly food assistance through SNAP and other nutrition programs. And so the politics of the Farm Bill of the last 2 cycles has been really the politics of SNAP. And in many respects, the politics of welfare. We'll get into that. And that's what intrigued me, is that we have a program, the nation's largest food assistance program, that has and this is part of the point of the talk, it's managed to survive and thrive as the nation's largest food assistance program for over 60 years, depending on when you, or at least 60 years, depending on when you count its origins, and further than that, 80 years if you go back to the New Deal period, which is what I'm going to talk about. So a quick primer. the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, for those who don't know much about it, SNAP, it supplements, hence the name, the food purchasing power of low-income households. That's the whole purpose. Its benefits are based on a, quote, thrifty food plan that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, nutritionists and economists, and they have many of both, have come up with, that, that it's essentially a basket of basic foods that a family that would need to have each month to have nutritious diet. And it's based on thrifty food plan that assumes home cooking. And this is an issue that there are people debating these days. And it's calibrated based on net household income and size. So, and with deductions for certain living expenses and assets. So the larger the family, obviously the thresholds for getting SNAP benefits, are lower, the larger the family and the lower the income. That's sort of the point. SNAP dollars are deposited directly into an electronic benefits transfer card, EBT debit card. There's no paper stamps any longer. Those paper stamps were phased out 20 years ago. Hence the name changed in 2008 to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, because we don't really use food stamps, but a lot of people still refer to it as food stamps, especially critics of the program. And unlike, and your SNAP benefits can only be used to buy food. No alcohol, no tobacco, no hot prepared foods, except under certain circumstances. For example, there are some exemptions for the elderly. You cannot cook, or certain, sometimes when there's some kind of a disaster, like a hurricane or something, the USDA will allow hot prepared foods to be purchased with your SNAP dollars. But SNAP is directly tied to food purchasing. That's an important point to keep in mind. And with the EBT card, it's very hard to get away with purchasing anything else. I mean, that's one of the things that actually they've discovered. So fraud rates are relatively small. Who gets SNAP? Prior to the pandemic, 81% of SNAP households are classified as living in poverty. They're below 130% of the poverty line. So they're poor or low income. Again, it also depends on family size. 60% of SNAP households have some kind of earned income, but not enough to get by. But roughly 40% of SNAP households have somebody who works in the household. So 60% of the households have some kind of earned income that could be from Social Security disability, or Social Security, senior, your Social Security benefits, or some other thing. But most, 60% of the households get some kind of income. They just don't make enough. 80% of SNAP households include children, the elderly, or disabled, and/or. And then finally, about 2/3, despite what people might think, 2/3 get benefits for 3 years or fewer. So, most SNAP households actually, there's a lot of actual churn in the SNAP budget, SNAP system. People might be on it for a month or two, they get off for several months or even a year, and they might get back on it depending on the fluctuations in their income. So SNAP is essentially tied to net family income, family size, and assets, and a few other things. SNAP utilization and spending, and this is over time from 1960 to present. SNAP before the pandemic, and I always hesitate because it's the quick spike up in 2020, served approximately 40 million Americans at roughly $60 billion a year prior to the pandemic. Now, of course, SNAP spending skyrockets with the pandemic, both because people lose jobs or lose income, but also because Congress boosted SNAP benefits through some of the stimulus package. The same thing happened, by the way, in 2009, 2013. There was a similar stimulus package increase. So a lot of the spike in post 2009, 2010 wasn't just because of the recession. It was also they boosted benefit levels, and they started trailing off. You see that after 2013. But what was remarkably sticky, and I'll talk about this later, was that a lot of the post-Great Recession increases in SNAP reliance did not dissipate as quickly as people thought. And that's because of, in some respect we'll talk about later, the stickiness, if you will, of low-wage jobs, or the prevalence of low-wage jobs compared to in the economy. So you might have a lower unemployment, but the wages people were making were relatively low. And hence the spike in SNAP spending with COVID hit low-wage earners especially hard. So, And spending fluctuates, of course, with macroeconomic and how matters and household income. So again, in this regard, SNAP is countercyclical most of the time to economic forces and to changes in income. As such, SNAP is really also an anti-poverty program. It supplements income as much as it supplements food purchasing. So it's now the nation's second most important anti-poverty program, if you don't count Social Security, after the earned income tax credit, which people don't really understand that point. People think that welfare, cash welfare, is the biggest part, but it's not. Cash welfare, especially on the federal government, on the Transitional Assistance to Needy Families Program, which has been in place since 1996, is tiny by comparison. It's locked in at $16 billion a year. It's an annual block grant that goes to the states. It serves roughly 3 million people. So it's welfare, as we understood it traditionally, is almost minuscule by comparison compared to SNAP and earned income tax credit, both of which, by the way, are what we call in-kind supports, not straight cash. That's an important distinction. And again, for some reason, my button didn't work. SNAP is in kind, not cash, but SNAP dollars supplement income. That's the whole point. Keep that in mind the entire time. It's widely critical because it's so big, because it's so expensive, comparatively speaking. It's widely criticized. It's easily caricatured, especially when you used to have stamps, and it's disliked by many, especially among more conservatives. And even a lot of liberals don't like SNAP as much. They rather have straight cash, but I'll get into that later on, why that's probably not likely. But the program survives. And this is what animated my project. And the book is, how does SNAP survive? As such, the biggest program of its kind. It's unique also. The United States is the only country that bases its food assistance policy on an in-kind or voucher system. Every other country, say, of similar economic level, provides straight cash assistance or cash welfare. So why does it survive? And why is SNAP in the Farm Bill? Let's go back to why is it in the Farm Bill? I'll get there. So we have to go back, like so many things in history, because if we trace the program's origins, we go back to the 1930s. And we go back to the 30s in the paradox, what we call the paradox of want amidst plenty, the Great Depression period. During the Great Depression, the first sector to feel the depression was, despite what people might think, farmers. Because farmers started feeling the pressure in the late 20s. They had maxed up production during World War I in response to some policies, but also because there was a high demand for their goods. But as you got into the late 20s, a combination of trade wars, economic depression, and overproduction led to large surpluses of commodities, which lowers, and as any economist in the room would say, if you have a surplus of a good, the effect is going to be lower the per basis, the cost per pound in this case of a good, which would force many farmers to go bankrupt because they couldn't cover their costs. And this was especially true for small farmers. And so the real dilemma facing Roosevelt when he came to office, that had bedeviled Hoover actually also, was how to deal with surpluses. As the surpluses are really pounding the agricultural sector, hurting farmers, forcing farmers out of farming. They were losing their farms. I mean, if you think about the Okies going to California, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, et cetera, those are people who lost their farms in part to low commodity prices. They couldn't cover their costs. They often couldn't, they took out loans on credit to pay for their seeds and other costs, and they couldn't cover their costs because commodity prices dropped so precipitously, in some cases 50% or more over a 5-year period. So how do you deal with surpluses? Well, you can manage production. That was, what Roosevelt tried to do. They pay farmers not to produce certain things, and sorry, I should have got, the bullet thing there. Or you can destroy crops and animals. Now, paying farmers not to produce things is not very popular. It's often ridiculed. So that's not we don't do that very much anymore. Or you can destroy crops and animals. And it was seen as, and that's what they did in some cases. They actually destroyed billions of pounds of pork, of pigs and piglets in 1933 to stabilize the prices. But this was seen, it was provoked an outrage. How could you destroy food during a time when people are standing in bread lines? It was seen as immoral and wasteful, and it was also bad optics. Destroying food, especially animals, was just, it was wildly criticized. And so they had to come up with other ways to figure out how to deal with surpluses. Because remember, the whole point of dealing with surpluses is to prop up farmers. You could export more. That became American agricultural policy mantra later. But in the 1930s, you had trade wars that were instituted by Congress. You had depression that reduced demand for food because people couldn't pay for more luxury goods like pork. You had the impending war that was having impact on export markets. So, what do? Well, you can encourage more domestic consumption. And this is what they fixed on, because not enough people were buying enough food, and there were people going hungry, and there were people who were undernourished, severely undernourished. So how do you do that? What do? And this was a dilemma that policymakers in the Department of Agriculture and elsewhere faced. Well, you could distribute surplus foods to the needy. This is the classic, you provide the box. And if you think about a lot of going to food pantries is that version of, that you would put surplus commodities into a monthly or a semi-monthly allotment, the box, and people would go and pick it up. Well, this was criticized widely as, it's difficult. It requires logistics, supply chains. It's expensive to do, and it's awkward. I mean, and also fears of impacts on the retail system, because when you give away free food to people, they don't need to buy it in the stores. Therefore, it hurts local retailers. And also, it's for a lot of people, it was regarded as shame-inducing. Standing in line for food was seen as sort of by a lot of people, not just social workers, it was seen as shame-inducing. It was really seen as sort of that people down the luck shouldn't be made to stand in a line for food. And you also didn't know what you're going to get. And people got stuff sometimes that they didn't know how to prepare, didn't like. I mean, it's like getting your CSA allotment and not knowing what to do with the turnips, and so you could do that, but and it was widely criticized for all these reasons. Or you could do or there was some suggestion of doing a sort of a discounted food system where the retailers would provide discounted foods to people who were verified to be low income, and able to buy more food at a subsidized cost. But that was opposed by the retail industry, because that retail in food industry didn't want to be they didn't want to be social workers. They didn't want to be welfare, sort of administrators. They don't want to have to clear these people. Or you could provide cash. But welfare even then was seen as demeaning or as again, contrary to the American notion of individual responsibility, self-worth, work. So, and there was no guarantee the poor would use the extra cash to buy food. They might use it for rent. Oh my goodness, or heat. So, there was a lot of debate about what to do, and they came up, U.S. Department of Agriculture experts and working with food retailers, classic New Deal sort of government working with industry, came up with the idea of a voucher system, essentially. So those deemed eligible, low income, and they would be deemed eligible by local relief agencies, would purchase a specific dollar amount of orange stamps there if you're not colorblind, the one on the left, a specified number of a dollar amount of orange stamps each month to buy, which could be used to buy any food product in any store that was participating. And for every dollar you spent up to a certain amount on buying with these orange stamps, you would get an additional 50 cents of free bonus blue stamps, which could only then be used on goods that were decreed or were signified as in surplus by the USDA. So, for example, if prunes were declared in surplus, which, believe it or not, they sometimes were, you could go to the store if you were just a person with food stamps, and you could use your blue stamps to buy a box of prunes in any store. It was the same box of prunes that somebody else could buy for cash. You were just using a different form of currency. That was the whole point. You go to a regular store, use either your orange stamp to buy any food or your blue stamps to buy foods that were declared in surplus. And the idea here was to, use the blue stamps especially to use up surpluses, to buy up surpluses, to encourage more food consumption. So stamps were not cash. The vouchers could only be used to buy food. Now, of course, did people sometimes sell their stamps for cash at discount? Yes, they did, but it was not as great as people thought it was. Not as especially in the 1930s version. It was not as common as people think. And the logic was you use the normal marketplace, the market and supply systems to provide food to lower income people and supplement their diets. You avoid what we call substitution effects. That is, that you because the blue stamps could only be used on foods declared in surplus, you would ensure that the poor would use those stamps to buy those foods. They wouldn't use it for something else, and it would boost their food consumption beyond which they would normally be spending because of their income levels. That was the idea. And the goal was to increase food consumption among low-income families for whom food purchases were very, what economists say, elastic, that is very price sensitive. Obviously poor people, the lower income you have, the more price sensitive you are. And this was seen, so this idea of the stamps was, remember, the whole point of the stamps was to use up surplus commodities and then to supplement the food purchasing abilities of low-income Americans. So the stamp plan starts in 1939 in Rochester, New York. It's administered by local relief agencies. It proves popular. What you're struck by is when you read the accounts of the time, how popular it proved among everybody, for the most part. It proved effective. It worked. It was spread to other cities in the country. Cities had to apply for it. But it did not extend all the way nationally just simply because of budget constraints. But at its height, and it was seen. Even the Chamber of Commerce supported it as using the normal, channels of business to provide this service, because you weren't competing with business. You were actually subsidizing food through it being purchased through the business channels. So you would use your normal, regular wholesale and retail chains. And so it was providing additional income to retailers in a very low margin business. So it was, at its height in 1941, it was serving nearly 4 million people who were buying food at some 200,000 retail operations. There was also commodity distribution going at the same time. There was a lot of that also going on because places that couldn't do food stamps were still doing direct commodity distribution at the same time. But the program was terminated in 1943. The war drives up surpluses. There's now food shortages and rationing and black markets. And so you don't have, the US Department of Agriculture decided the need for food stamps was no longer relevant. There was no depression, there was no food surpluses. So the rationale for food stamps no longer made sense, at least in the USDA's eyes. Other people thought that the stamps should be kept as a fairer way of doing rationing. But that's an aside that I won't get into. But so this food stamp program is terminated by the department, even though everybody agreed that it worked. It did what it was supposed to do. But it was seen by the USDA as no longer really relevant because there was no depression anymore and there was no surpluses. And the immediate post-war period, in the 40s and around in the 40s, there's no surpluses either for the most part because of post-war global demand for food. And the US Department of Agriculture no longer sees food stamps as needed. This changes. So remember, the food stamp program is terminated, but it's remembered. And its spirit is kept alive through the 1950s by some members of Congress and by even USDA bureaucrats as maybe a tool to take off the shelf at some point, because what happens in the 50s is surpluses reemerge in a big way. Advances in science and technology and the ability to grow more food and per acre with less labor means that by the mid-50s, the problem in agriculture, the US Department of Agriculture, is surplus, storing billions of bushels of surplus corn and wheat and other grains on ships, literally, or in warehouses that are being leased. And by the late 50s, buying and storing surplus commodities becomes the US Department of Agriculture's single largest expense and one of the largest non-defense expenses of the US government, and widely criticized. But again, the USDA is not inclined to bring back stamps because it didn't think it was a very effective surplus removal strategy. It actually turns out that it didn't have as big of an impact on the surplus as other ways of getting rid of it, like giving food away to the poor people, or shipping it to schools. The school lunch programs begin as surplus distribution in the 1940s. Milk and cheese, all that kind of surplus dairy, especially peanut butter. So that's the origin of the school meals program, is that same way of getting rid of surpluses. And the criticism of the USDA about, again, surplus purchase and storage programs, and also the Eisenhower era surplus boxes for the poor. Again, they had revived the commodity distribution programs. So poor people were getting literally the box of food once or twice a month, surplus commodities, whatever was available, which would vary tremendously from month to month. So finally, the operative point here is by the late 50s, the growing power of urban Democrats in Congress that is able to overcome the resistance by the agricultural bloc in Congress. And, and basically in 1959, Congress authorizes the USDA to revive the food stamp program in a series of pilot programs. Eisenhower does not follow through because Eisenhower and Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture don't think stamps are a very useful surplus diversion strategy. They prefer to focus on commodity distribution. But John Kennedy, in the 1960 election, famously, quote, discovers hunger while he's campaigning in West Virginia, on the West Virginia primary against Hubert Humphrey. And also had been critical of the Eisenhower commodity distribution program. And the very first thing that Kennedy does on taking office in 1961, well, the second thing, was he revives the food stamp program, because Congress has already authorized it, but he uses the authority of the USDA to initiate a new set of food stamp pilot programs. But this time it's simpler, because a lot of the experts in USDA who run the old program in the late 30s and early 40s had thought about it. Literally, some of these economists had been around for 30, 40 years in the USDA, and they had thought of ways to tweak the program, even though their bosses didn't care about it. And instead of having the orange stamps and blue stamps, they got rid of that all and just had one type of stamp at different denominations. This is 1960s era food stamps. You see the $1, $5, and $10 denominations. And you had one type of stamp, no longer tied explicitly to surplus removal, although implicitly was always there. Because again, if you boost people, if you boost the food consumption ability of low-income people, theoretically, that helps the farm sector by boosting, consumption and the demand for their goods. But again, the poor still must purchase a specified amount of stamps. Why require the poor to buy stamps? In part, it was to make sure they had, they were a participant in their own welfare. So you for every dollar you would buy for every dollar stamps you would buy, you would get a bonus amount of stamps. So if you bought, $2 worth of stamps, you would get another $1 worth of a bonus stamp. So you effectively have $3 worth. And you could use those stamps. There's no different colors. Well, despite the colors there was no orange stamp, blue stamp thing anymore. It was just stamps. And you would use the stamps to buy most foods in any retail food store. That was the point. And these pilot projects started, there was 8 of them in 1961, and then they grew to like 25 in 62. And by 1963, there were almost 40 of them. They were proving popular. They seemed to work. People thought they did a better job than commodity distribution of providing better nutrition for low-income residents through grocery stores and other retailers, and that people liked using stamps better than standing in line for food. It was less demeaning to the poor. Our image of stamps, remember, it's contrasted to what else was available, and that was standing in line for the box. That was the point. So it was expanded over the next 3 years, generally positive reviews. Kennedy decides to seek a permanent authorization for this food stamp program, but of course, by 64, he's been assassinated. And so the 1964 Food Stamp Act, on which the current program is based, it's the original authorization is 1964 Food Stamp Act. It makes stamps a permanent program under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Why not health, human health, education, and welfare? Because it was seen still through the lens of agricultural policy, and it was dictated by the agricultural committees in Congress. And without the support of the agricultural sector in Congress, you were never going to have food stamps. That was just reality of it all. It was pushed through by Johnson as part of his war on poverty. And it was only passed after urban liberals threatened to block farm subsidy programs unless rural conservatives voted for nutrition programs. Classic, this is a classic, what we call quid pro quo in Congress. That is, what was quite clear after some bumpiness in the legislative process, that urban Democrats basically said in no small words, few words, if you don't, to Southern Democrats, in particular Southern conservatives, if you don't support food stamps, we are going to block your cotton program. And rural conservatives got the message because they saw their numbers decreasing as the nation became more suburban and urban. Without the support of urban Democrats, rural conservatives, rural Democrats in particular, were not going to get their farm programs. So the deal was struck. The farm programs plus food stamp marriage began, which still holds to this day, which is part of the secret to its longevity. So it made stamps an entitlement program. If you qualified for stamps, you got benefits. Although in the early years, the budget was limited, so it wasn't fully funded. So quick tour of the past 50 years. Food stamps really begin to expand. Nixon, of all people, really dramatically increased benefits and reduced purchase prices. It makes the program national. And you see this dramatic growth in program spending in the early 70s, probably because of Nixon's actions, which were done in part to ward off George McGovern as he was heading toward the 1972 election. This is very much Nixon trying to outdo his potential, rivals. And also, it was actually seen as a more effective way of supplementing food consumption among the poor. Nixon didn't think commodity distribution was all that useful. The food stamp program is formally folded into the Farm Bill in 1973 by the rural conservatives. They put it into the Farm Bill as a way of locking in urban liberal support for farm programs. The deal gets institutionalized because the rural conservatives realize that without urban liberal support, especially Democrats, they can't get their commodity subsidies and their commodity programs, however shaped. And what you see also in the 70s is the emergence of a bipartisan coalition anchored by George McGovern on the left and Bob Dole on the right. The famous, we forget that Bob Dole and George McGovern, once upon a time, there was this bipartisan coalition behind food stamps anchored by McGovern and Dole, bitter partisans, bitter rivals in any other thing, but on food, they were on the same page. And Bob Dole became one of the biggest supporters of the food stamp program through the 1960s. And in part because of Dole, and who wanted to make sure the program worked, liberals began to focus on not just expanding benefits, but making sure the program was kept free of scandal. So they began to tighten up rules and focus on ways to make sure the program was kept relatively free from scandal, which wasn't always easy to do, especially with paper stamps. So there's bipartisan support. The Food Stamp Act of 1977 finally eliminates the purchase requirement, because the purchase requirement was the criticism of the purchase requirement was that if you really were poor and had very little cash, you couldn't afford the stamps. And indeed, getting rid of the purchase requirement was the last step in some respects to making food stamps essentially, quote, a welfare program, or income support program. More of the eligible get benefits now. They seek out benefits, especially among the elderly, who were reluctant to use their money on food stamps before because they didn't know if they could make it through the month. And then the late 1970s recession that drives up enrollment and spending. So by the late 70s, food stamps not only are important as a food supplement, but they're now important as an income supplement, and they're seen increasingly by critics as a form of welfare, which then leads us to Ronald Reagan. Food stamps as welfare. And so that much of the debate from the 80s onward is food stamps, quote, as welfare. Reagan's budget cuts in the early 80s severely cut back food stamp and other nutrition program spending for a couple of years. At the very moment there's a recession, the great recession, early part of the 1980s, which hits the Rust Belt, hits the industrial heartland particularly hard. And this is where you see this juncture, the cutback in nutrition programs, at the same time you get spikes in need, leads to the emergence of food pantries and food banks. That's where they all come from in some respects. And and look, that's a different story. But the point is, a lot of what we see now in, quote, the emergency food system, the Greater Boston Food Bank and food pantries, have their origins in the early 80s gaps in federal nutrition program coverage at the very moment, there was a need. Now, those cuts were eventually reversed by Congress as the need was there. What's fascinating about the politics of food stamps is that every time there's a cutback, it's eventually reversed as evidence of hunger and malnutrition or undernutrition resurfaces. Americans may not like welfare, but they hate their fellow Americans going hungry. And so you see this recurring cycle of cutbacks by conservatives, and then it rebounds as benefits are reinstituted and even expanded. 1996 welfare reform eliminates federal cash assistance for the most part, makes food stamp, which makes food stamps more critical than ever as an income supplement. The 2002 Farm Bill under George W. Bush, Bush reinstates eligibility for a lot of people cut back by welfare reform, especially immigrants, legal immigrants, and others under his compassionate conservative views. Food stamps, what's important about food stamps, what's different is that food stamps had in it, and it's something I'll get to a little bit later, work orientations that welfare didn't, that made it easier for conservatives, or at least moderates, to support. And Bush supported food stamps as part of his compassionate conservative agenda. Paper stamps are phased out. 2002-8 Farm Bill becomes, food stamp program becomes SNAP. And then the last two farm bills, 2014 and 2018, you see conservatives, conservative Republicans, especially in the House, trying to cut back SNAP each time, but failing. Even with Trump, they failed each time. And the question is, why? I mean, in fact, everybody in 2018, if you had been a betting person and said Republicans controlled both the House and Senate and the White House, you would have bet that food stamps would have been cut back. And yet they weren't. Why? Well, because SNAP has a lot of friends. And this is the point that what people have missed over time is that, remember, it's a $60 billion a year expenditure before the pandemic. During the pandemic, it went to $130 billion. That amount of money going into the system is essentially, in many respects, an indirect subsidy to the food system. So you've got Walmart loves SNAP. Coca-Cola loves SNAP. Banks, which get paid to process SNAP payments, retailers, the food industry, craft, everybody. That state governments, for the most part, like SNAP because SNAP is free federal money. States have to pay half the administrative expenses, but essentially you've got millions of dollars of federal money coming in, which is seen by many state governments, including in Massachusetts, as economic stimulus money. In fact, what's been interesting is Massachusetts went went under Bill Weld, then especially under Romney, they turned around the state SNAP program from being essentially a very low enrolled program, a lot of barriers to entry, and they went out and really expanded. They went out and basically made sure they reached out to anybody who's eligible, to the point that Massachusetts now is one of a handful of states that legitimately can be said enrolls pretty much everybody who's eligible. Because in fact, that's federal money coming into the state and being spent in local retailers. So it's seen in that economic stimulus term. Unlike welfare, unlike cash welfare, which everybody thought was a bad, had a lot more critics, didn't have many friends. SNAP has a lot of friends in powerful places, including, forget about the beneficiaries. It has friends in corporate America. In fact, some call it the Walmart Hunger Coalition that supports SNAP. By the way, just a quick sideline, U.S. nutrition programs generally, this is an important point to keep in mind, that reason why SNAP survives is it has a lot of friends. Over time, it's evolved into a program that everybody benefits from in some way, shape, or form. A lot of people do, especially financially. And even people who are the beneficiaries benefit, which is sort of the ironic part. Other than U.S. nutrition programs, remember, the point about nutrition programs in the United States is that all of them have origins, for the most part, in agricultural policies, subsidizing the food system. SNAP, of course. School meal programs have their origins in donations of surplus commodities to schools. The Women's, Infants, and Children's program, very prescriptive, tied to specific foods that are designed to promote nutrition for women with young children or infants. the Emergency Food Assistance Program, which has its origins, ironically, in Reagan era program to get rid of surplus cheese. They started dumping all the surplus cheese in the local food pantries and local relief organizations without any money to support distribution or and ways to do it. And it's created an uproar. They had government cheese literally being handed out and people in lines. And so it finances the distribution of surplus commodities and other foods to food banks. Its origins were the temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, but Congress in 1990 changed the name to the Emergency Food Assistance Program. So the temporary became permanent. I'll leave you to decide what that all means. That essentially we've got a program that was meant to be temporary. Now it's essentially permanent. About $1 billion a year being used to subsidize essentially food banks and their ability to distribute food out to sometimes surplus foods, but other foods sometimes that are purchased to food pantries and other service agencies, relief agencies. And these are all administered by the USDA. And that's important because as long as they're administered by the USDA and overseen by the agriculture committees in Congress, they're anchored in agricultural policy making, which gives them political cover against charges of welfare. So why SNAP survives? It survives because, first and foremost, again, as I pointed out, it survives because it offers in-kind benefits, not cash per se, but it's just easier to track and to target and defend. It's linked to food production, even if it's an incidental linkage, it gives it political cover. Conservatives can rationalize SNAP as a way to support agriculture, not as a welfare program. And even there, they can live with it as a safety net program. Even a lot of conservatives who voted for welfare reform in the 90s did so with knowledge that food stamps would be there as a safety net. So as long as, but if the conservatives' view is that SNAP should not disincentivize work. Okay, and that's their biggest things about work programs. That's a separate discussion. Liberals support SNAP as an anti-poverty program. And their lesson from welfare reform in the 90s was that they would never, ever allow SNAP to be cut back or never allow it to be block granted like welfare was. And so the liberals in Congress make it very clear, mostly Democrats, Jim McGovern's the most ardent of them. Liberals will never vote for a farm bill ever if SNAP is cut back dramatically. And rural conservatives know this, which is why SNAP still survives, even under Republican control. Liberal support for farm programs hinges on conservative support for SNAP. It's a classic quid pro quo. Now, there's a whole group of Republican conservatives in suburban areas, the so-called Freedom Caucus conservatives who dislike both SNAP and farm programs. They're the ones that try to cut back both. But there's enough members of Congress, especially in the Senate, that want to preserve both, that they're able to withstand the most ardent ideological conservatives in cutting back SNAP. So, okay, does it work? Real quickly, I'm going a little bit long. As a nutrition program, because I know I'm going to get this question, it lessens food insecurity. There's no argument about that. The literature says that. It likely enhances the quality and nutritional value of food consumed by low-income people. But there's no evidence that SNAP as such makes a major difference in nutrition. People do have less food insecurity, which is good. SNAP users are little different than people of similar incomes. They will buy just as much Coca-Cola as other people who are low income, or just as much as anything. Because again, a lot of times it's time, it's income, whatever. Proposals to prohibit SNAP use on bad foods are unlikely to work because substitution effects, people just use their other dollars. If people want a Coke, they're going to buy a Coke. And in fact, the business sector really opposes this kind of idea because for them, there's no such thing as bad food. But there's a lot of evidence from economists and others that any kind of ban on SNAP use on quote bad foods probably wouldn't work. But what does work are SNAP bonus programs like Healthy Incentives Program in Massachusetts and others that give people a bonus amount of SNAP dollars to use at farmers markets and other places to buy more fruits and vegetables. Those do work. So we see those evidence. Is it a good anti-poverty program? Well, it's highly responsive to shifts in household income. SNAP dollars enable low-income households to free up cash for other purposes. Again, rent. The graduated benefits are avoid what they call benefits cliffs. They avoid those things. So what they've worked out over time is the benefits levels are graduated in such a way that if you happen to work and make more income, you'll still get SNAP benefits up to a certain point, but it's not going to be cut off automatically. So you're allowed to still work so long as you're not making beyond a certain amount, but it's graduated so that it's a gradual decline of benefits for all the money, for every dollar you make, not a sharp cutoff. So it doesn't disincentivize work like old welfare used to. Having said that, it may inadvertently be a subsidy for low-wage jobs. I mean, the old, it's not a surprise that Walmart is not only the nation's largest redeemer of SNAP dollars, but also a lot of its workers also get SNAP. So there's that issue. So SNAP is flawed, overly rule-bound, a lot of people believe because of trying to avoid scandal. But in the end, whoops, I cut that off, sorry. In the end, it may be better than the alternatives. And I can easily talk more about that later. So, oops, there you go. Conclusions flawed. I actually cut my slides. And it may be better than the alternatives because it may be the only way that Americans can agree on how to supplement the food and income for the poor, given attitudes about welfare. It also may work better as a food supplement than a lot of the other options. So we can talk more about that. Anyway, I've gone a little bit over, but I'm a professor, so that's not unusual. So anyway, thanks a lot for listening. Happy to take questions.
Chris, thank you very much. It was a very interesting and informative presentation. I learned a good bit about the history of it. I guess I have one quick question. Do you know the impact directly or indirectly on the farmers? I mean, you talk about the food sector,
Yeah.
but how much does it seem to help the farmers? And I assume the farmers are some of the rural people that you're talking about generating the political support that it needs to survive. So.
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're producing 3,000 acres of corn in Iowa, it has no impact whatsoever, because it's a trivial amount. I mean, but however, if you're producing what we've seen, what the experts have seen, again, it's marginal in the sense that there's so much food produced in this country, especially basic commodity crops, that the $60 billion a year spent on SNAP of SNAP spending is really a marginal impact for big ag. But what's interesting is that a lot of these SNAP incentive programs and SNAP spending generally have impacts for local farms especially, and also for smaller operations that are selling fruits and vegetables and other sort of value commodities. So these incentive programs that people can use their SNAP dollars at farmers markets prove very popular with local farmers. So yeah, you're right. I mean, in a sense, the SNAP program doesn't have a huge impact for big agriculture because, again, it's just so big. I mean, the volume of stuff coming out of big ag, so it has some impact. It's probably has a bigger impact on Walmart than it does on farmers. But the agricultural sector lives with it and supports it because it is a sort of a benefit of some sort, especially again for these small farmers who are producing fruits and vegetables. There is some evidence of a direct correlation there.
Thanks. Anybody have any questions they would like to ask? Raise your hand either through Zoom or physically raise your hand. I see Linda. Linda, you got to unmute yourself. Linda, unmute yourself. There you go. Yep,
I
yep.
wonder what the future is for food stamps. I have a granddaughter with autism. She is in Connecticut, and for some reason they feel, she used to live in Massachusetts, they feel the program in Connecticut is much more generous. How can that be if it's under the USDA?
Well, the benefit levels are set by the USDA. And I was saying, so if it's seen as more generous, it might be because Connecticut makes it easier for to hook up with other kinds of programs. It just depends. I mean,
It does.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, states do vary in how well they administer the program and how much they link it up with other kinds of benefit programs. Connecticut may do a better job in that respect on linking up SNAP with, say, other forms of assistance and making it easier to obtain those other forms, whether it's heating allowances or housing vouchers or whatever. Some states are much better, and Massachusetts has gotten better, but still not as good as some states at making those connections with other kinds of support programs, especially for certain populations that, you know, are harder to sort of reach. But yeah, it will vary by state. I mean, in some surprising ways, states that you would think would do a good job at it may not, because for a lot of reasons, and states that you would be surprised by. But again, it does vary by state. There's little evidence that people actually move from state to state based on the SNAP program. But clearly, the ability of a state government to implement the program does vary. Its interest in and its ability to administer the program well, and to connect it to other kinds of support. But the benefits levels in SNAP by itself are set by the federal government.
So Chris, if they're equal across the board, what about people who live in high cost cities?
Yeah. That is, and SNAP is not prorated based on cost of living. So it actually is a bit of a benefit for rural America, which is another reason why it's supported. It's actually disproportionately benefits lower cost areas. Yeah, that's one of the. But the difference there is, well, actually, it's not direct. The benefit levels are not affected. What is different is that the deductions for cost of living will be adjusted depending on where you live. So in fact, although the benefit levels themselves, narrowly speaking, are not different, because SNAP calculating the net income does take into account living expenses. So higher cost areas, you might get higher deductions for living expenses, especially rent. But you're right. I mean, there is sort of a degree to which SNAP, in some ways, disproportionately benefits lower cost areas of living area. But they do make some adjustments based on cost of living in the deductions, not the benefits themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's effectively the same, but.
Any other questions? Any other hands? Gail? You have to unmute yourself, Gail. Gail, unmute yourself.
Okay. You say food pantries get some of the surplus food, right?
Some, yes.
How is that? Like, does the Needham Food Pantry get some?
Oh, yeah.
Gets that? Just the big.
Well, I don't know whether the Needham Food Pantry gets its food, but I'm willing to bet it gets a chunk of its food from the Greater Boston Food Bank. Either purchases that food from the Greater Boston Food Bank, or gets it for free, depending on, but usually the food pantry system works that you have a regional food bank, Greater Boston Food Bank, with its massive operation. The Greater Boston Food Bank will get some food from local supermarket chains, so that's Stop and Shop famously, surplus foods. It will get, but majority of the food that food banks get these days is really either U.S. Department of Agriculture surplus commodities, and a lot of that jacked up during the pandemic, because again, a lot of institutions closed during the pandemic, restaurants, schools, cruise lines. So there's more surplus food in the system. Or under TFAP, will provide money to the Greater Boston Food Bank to purchase food at a discount through the retail marketplace, and then distribute those foods to its constituent organizations, whether food pantries or relief agencies or service agencies. So I don't know specifically, but I'm willing to bet that the Needham Food Pantry purchases some of its food or gets some of its food in some way, shape, or form from the food bank. And that system sort of evolves from the 1980s, from originally 13 food banks in 1981 to over 200 by the end of the decade. And so the food bank system really just explodes in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I'll leave aside the discussion about whether that's a good thing.
And any more questions?
Becky,
Go ahead.
Um, could you just say a bit more about, you said that Massachusetts has done a good job of finding everybody who's
Better.
eligible?
Yeah.
Or better than others?
Yeah,
or
it's
some others.
the last data is that it nearly 100% eligibility. You know, it was able to, it reaches out to, you know, nearly 100%. It's been able to enroll pretty much everybody who's eligible. Now that was in 2017, the last time we have complete data.
So why would other states, if it's to everyone's advantage, including industry's advantage, why would other states not want to also reach
Well-
100%?
Well, there are states like Wyoming where it's only like 50%, where frankly, the people in the state regard any form of welfare as a bad idea because they're very, much, minimal government, low, and they don't invest any effort. They don't have an online application process. They make it harder for people to apply or to renew. It depends on the state's culture, depends on the state's, way they organize this, some states, like, if you have a state like California where it's organized by counties, it's harder to get 100% simply because some counties just don't do a very good job. Other
Wow.
states, other states do. Florida does a very good job, comparatively speaking. At least it did. Because it actually has full-time SNAP outreach coordinators whose job it is to enroll everybody possible. Because again, they see it as free federal money coming in.
Yeah.
So again, it just depends on the state. Obviously, you can imagine some of the usual suspects. Some of the southern states, some of the western states are not as forward-looking on this.
Yeah.
because,
It's
again,
like healthcare, I guess.
their attitudes toward government in general, their attitudes toward welfare or social welfare programs in general. But some southern states, some states are much better than others. Just depends on the attitudes of their governors and the attitudes of their state legislature, or just the attitudes there about SNAP dollars as supplemental. It's a funny. I mean, I've looked at this, and it's not as easy. It's not as nice and clean as you think.
Wow. This is really useful. Thank you.
Sure.
Nancy?
I very much enjoyed your presentation. I had to leave for a couple minutes, so you may have talked about the question I'm going to raise. I was wondering about whether SNAP partners with any kind of educational agencies to do more of the talking about nutrition
Right.
and
Yeah.
good choices.
There is a separate program called SNAP Ed that the USDA also has. That's financed for that very reason, is to, again, it's the notion of we just educate people better, they'll make better food choices, be more nutritional diet. So SNAP Ed is a separate program, but it's oftentimes linked up in some of the same agencies that will sort of, that will reach out on SNAP enrollments. There's a bit of that going on in social welfare organizations, that maybe deal with families with kids and that kind of thing. So there's a fair bit of education effort in the SNAP program, again, through a separate parallel program. The irony about SNAP, is that a lot of the difficulties, at least the evidence is, a lot of the difficulties is not lack of knowledge so much as lack of time. Low-income people don't have time. A lot, as much. And one of the biggest problems, and one of the debates now within SNAP communities about the expectation that you prepare all your food at home, is that a lot of people who are poor or low income, they're working, they're also time stressed and income stressed, and so that's a dilemma there. So yeah, but there is an education program that's pretty well regarded, actually.
And does that exist in most states?
Yeah,
For all states?
Any state that, it exists in most states. Now, again, how well it works and how well it's implemented is a state function, like so much of the stuff in the United States. We have federalism. But again, there's a degree to which it seems to work better than a lot of programs.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Becky.
Just following up on that, I don't know if it was about SNAP, but I was hearing an argument on the radio about that the same food could be purchased cold, but by some program, but if you picked it up hot, which
Yes.
the rest of us can all do because we're running and we
Right.
want to just put it on the table. It can't be paid for by this,
Yeah.
whatever this
By
program
SNAP.
was.
Yeah.
Was
Well,
that SNAP?
Yeah, it's SNAP. I mean, literally,
Okay.
you cannot use your SNAP benefits, your EBT card, to buy hot prepared foods under
It
most
was-
circumstances.
It's crazy. It's totally crazy.
Well, that's
Who
one of the
needs it
debates
more?
now. Yeah, that's one of the debates now is how to change that.
Chris, on that same topic, I remember it's been a while since I studied any of this issue, but that the old food stamp program couldn't be used for paper goods. Can SNAP be used for paper goods now?
I don't think so. It's still, it's only food.
So no toilet paper, no paper
No.
towels.
No. And that's been a pretty hard line in the ag community and in USDA. They just don't want to see that happen.
It's sort of interesting.
Because once that happens, then SNAP clearly is simply, a welfare provision. So there's really the attachment to food that gives it political cover.
Well, but I mean, paper products
Oh, no
Come from-
argument.
come from trees.
Yeah,
That's agriculture.
yeah, it's true. The debate has been made. It's never succeeded. So yeah, but yeah, no, you can see the dilemma here. I mean, and again, there's all these debates go on about prohibiting its use on certain foods or expanding its use for non-food items. And the USDA's attitude is, it's about food, and so yeah, you get these fights going on all the time.
I assume non-alcoholic, I mean, no alcohol.
Oh,
stuff.
no alcohol, no tobacco. Oh, no.
Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask you about if you're homeless. I mean, you obviously are not cooking. Is the program worthwhile for homeless people?
Well, the USDA, under some conditions, does provide SNAP for every rule, there are certain exceptions made. And I think that, and don't quote me on this, but I think that in certain states, homeless people have been able to obtain SNAP benefits. Now, remember, you sort of need a residence, but SNAP benefits, you've been able to obtain SNAP benefits, for some homeless people through certain institutional settings, shelters, that kind of thing. But it's difficult. You can imagine that most homeless probably are not getting SNAP benefits.
By the way, Chris, that's my wife, Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, Chris.
It's been a long time since I've seen you. Yeah. Yeah, it's a dilemma because you have also people living in transitional housing and all kinds of other things. Yeah. And I think they've been trying to tweak the program, especially under the pandemic, to make it more responsive to these kinds of situations.
Is there any effort to work with, states or communities to create more grocery stores that have fresh produce? And, again, you mentioned time is a critical factor. If you've got to drive or take a bus to, wherever to get your food, it would be much easier if you had a local vendor.
Yeah. Well,
Is there an effort to do that?
Well, SNAP, the USDA tries to ensure that everybody that any store that does sell food is enrolled, that takes SNAP benefits, takes EBT. I mean, USDA really has a desire to make sure that every local corner store, even anybody who sells food at all, even dollar stores, takes EBT.
Oh.
In fact, dollar stores take EBT because it's good for their bottom lines. What you're asking is a slightly different question: is how do we create more places that can offer affordable foods that are healthy, that also then take EBT cards? And so there's an experiment now in Boston by Doug Rao, former Trader Joe's chief executive, the Daily Table. It's got one in Dorchester, one in Roxbury now, I think one in Chelsea now, that essentially is taking surplus foods and other foods and offering them at lower prices to people of certain zip codes, especially, but doesn't prohibit others, and also takes EBT. And they do a lot of prepared foods that are not hot, but can be warmed up when you get home. So they're trying hard to figure out ways to sort of make this work for as many people as possible. And USDA, especially, it depends what administration you're in, this is what does vary, The USDA, certainly under Obama, and again, I suspect under Biden, will be more willing to try these experiments than maybe it was under Trump. Again, I think the USDA's attitude is, get people buying food. Still has that orientation.
What a nice thought.
Chris, I guess I have one other question. I don't mean, if anybody else has a question, please, I don't want to try to dominate this. But again, when I used to teach a course on income and poverty, welfare couldn't go to single men. Are there any restrictions like that on SNAP programs?
No, in fact, another reason why SNAP probably is done a better is that it didn't have old AFDC's bias. Now, again, it's household size. So if you're a single person,
right,
then your income, but again, a single household, it's a household income. So if you're poor and you're single, especially if you're elderly or disabled, I mean, there's those provisions in there. Especially if you're an SSI disability, then you're almost automatically enrolled in SNAP if you're an SSI disability, in that respect. But yeah, there's less of that sort of. Now, if you're an able-bodied adult without dependence, and you're expected to be working. So there's certain rules about that. But you can work and still get SNAP if you're not making enough money. So again, there's that sort of mentality. Or if you're able-bodied and not working, you should be enrolled in some state program to train you. There's a lot of this kind of work rules thing, which a lot of states we frankly regard as a hassle. But, and they seek waivers from them all the time.
Right.
But yeah, it doesn't have the benefits cliffs problems of the old AFDC. It doesn't have the old AFDC's old bias against, unmarried couples and all those other things.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Anybody else with any questions?
In fact, you could be a household of entirely unrelated people as long as you're a household unit.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you have to prove you're a household unit. There's rules for how to do that, but yeah.
Well, I don't see any other hands. I mean, half the people aren't there anyway, so I can't see them,
They're being shy.
I guess. So if there are no other questions, thank you, Chris, very much.
It's my pleasure.
It was great to see you.
Good to see you.
It was very interesting and enjoyable. And thank you again.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And thanks for listening.
And I also want to thank you. I think it's been just terrific. And I just want to let people know that our next program is February 22nd. And it's titled Food as Medicine. Jean Terranova, Director of Food and Health Policy at Community Servings, will be speaking. And they've been very active in providing food for people who've got medical needs, and they're working hard to get insurance to cover some of that. So that should be interesting as well. After that, we have a program called Circle of Life, the life cycle of food from production to disposal, and the relationship between value and price, which should be very interesting. And the last one is Farm Worker Health and Environmental Justice, the Perils of Pesticide Intensive Agriculture. So it's quite a diverse group of speakers, but all related to our overall topic of a just harvest, ethical food production, consumption, and policy. So we encourage people to come back. If you are interested, if you're not on our mailing list, if you want to put your name in the chat, I will put you on our mailing list for the rest of these talks. And so just add that to the chat, and I'll make sure that happens. And Chris, I want to thank you again.
It's my pleasure.
Just wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
How many people were on?
Okay.